All right, another kind of area that, gets a lot of very interesting research in the field of social psychology, again, there's some overlap with cognitive psychology as well, is, within the justice system and how our justice system sort of functions, status quo now, what are ways that we can make it better so that it, reduces rates of like innocent people being locked up, what are ways that we can, get more guilty people through the justice system. What are ways that we can maybe even change the justice system to where it's less punitive and more, like the rehabilitatory in nature. I don't know if that was the right word, but you guys get what I mean. So I'm going to talk about two specific areas in the justice system that have gotten quite a bit of research in social psychology. The first is in the way that interrogations are conducted, particularly interrogations of like suspects, right? And then we'll talk also about eyewitness testimony, which we've already kind of talked about a little bit, or I've at least like alluded to it in previous lectures, but we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. Before we start, I think I've also done what I'm about to do before, but it's good to have a reminder. I just want us to kind of think about like, the steps that typically happen if there is some sort of crime committed. Crime is committed. There may or may not be witnesses at the scene who see the crime happen. The cops are going to do an investigation, which is going to lead to a suspect. That suspect may or may not be the person who actually committed the crime. So one of the things you got to keep straight is there's the perpetrator. The perpetrator is the person who actually did it. And then there's the suspect is the person who the cops think did it, basically. Let's see. Through that investigation, then they will eventually, bring in the suspect and do some kind of interrogation where they basically try to get their side of the story, try to figure out if they're lying, if they have an alibi, etc. They also will bring in witnesses and ask them questions and have them do things like lineup procedures. We'll talk more about the lineup procedure in a second when we talk about eyewitness testimony. And then, in some cases, all of that will lead to a trial. I will say a lot of cases don't lead to a trial because they do what's called a plea bargain, where they basically have the suspect, admit guilt in exchange for something like a reduced sentence, immunity in some cases. But if it leads to a trial, then the witness, which we'll talk about again in a second, is also going to kind of like give their account during that trial as well. So just kind of keep some of those steps. Sometimes it's good to have that kind of background in your head as you're thinking through some of these topics I'm going to talk about. So first, let's talk about the process of interrogations and kind of what research says in this area. So traditionally, cops in most precincts, whenever they're interrogating a suspect, they use a technique that's called the Reid technique. And it's called the Reid technique because it was developed by a person named Reid. I think the person named Reid actually was a psychologist I should have looked at the date before I came here, but it was probably in like 1930s, 1940s maybe, is when Reid developed this particular technique. But it turns out that this technique is based on a lot of assumptions of human behavior that do not seem to be true. One of the assumptions of human behavior that it is based on is the idea that you can tell if someone is lying based off of certain like tells or cues. So we all probably have kind of this misconception. You might think like, oh, if someone's lying, they're not going to make eye contact. They're going to be fidgety. They're going to use uhs and ums and stutter and all of that. Turns out none of that is true whatsoever. If someone is fidgety, not making eye contact, that might imply that they're nervous, but lying is not the only reason to be nervous. If you're in an interrogation being interrogated by cops, that by its nature is going to make people nervous, no matter if they're lying or telling the truth, right? There are actually studies that they've done where they've used normal participants and also cops and had them basically try to detect if someone was lying. So they'll have a participant who tells a story. Half the time the story is true, half the time the story is a lie. And then they test if the cop and the regular person can tell if they're lying. Both the cops and regular people basically can tell a chance percentage if someone's lying. So they'll get it right about 50% of the time, just by chance, because your only options are they're lying or they're telling the truth, right? So cops are no better at detecting lies than anybody else, basically. Let's see. So basically, I'm going to go through kind of the steps of the Reid technique, just so you know kind of what they do, basically. And I will say, like, from my understanding of reading this Reid technique, I will say like TV shows and movies kind of show that Reid technique. Like if you see in a TV show a cop doing an interrogation, it's probably a very exaggerated version of the Reid technique, but kind of the gist of it is very similar to this philosophy, basically. One of the things about the Reid technique, too, is that oftentimes the interrogator goes into that scenario assuming the person is guilty. So everything starts from a presumption of guilt. And so usually they'll start by asking the suspect like really baseline questions, things that they would not lie about, just kind of like normal, you know, how's your day going? Details about like their name, you know, things that the cops can easily verify. And that's to get kind of a baseline of behavior to try to start determining like how does this person act normally when they're not lying. Then they will often tell the suspect that they have evidence, and they might exaggerate the amount of evidence that they have. They can lie about that evidence, basically, and make it sound like, you know, we already have a case against you, so it's in your best interest to admit that you're guilty. They will do this technique where they try to shift blame away from the suspect. So they might, you know, say, oh, well, we know you're part of this group, and we know that this group likes to, you know, commit these types of crimes, and you can't help it that you're part of this group, so it's not really your fault that you did this crime, right? So they're trying to shift blame away. Or they might even try to kind of like justify or moralize the crime in order to make the suspect feel more like, you know, it isn't the big deal that I did this thing, so I can admit that I'm guilty and I won't really have any consequences. Then they also kind of make a point to not ever give the suspect an opportunity to deny it. So if the suspect starts to say something to deny that they committed this crime, the cop will often cut them off and like interrupt them, not allow them to say that, basically. Eventually, the hope is that they will kind of narrow it down to where they give the suspect like two alternative options or two stories, two versions of the crime. So they'll say, okay, I could see that, you know, you committed this crime because you were stressed out and you were worried about your family and all these like, you know, justifications, or you committed this crime because you're just a bad person and, you know, you wanted to do it because you liked it. So they give them two alternatives. One is kind of like morally better than the other one, but both of those options are admitting guilt, okay? So as the suspect, if you choose either of those, you're admitting you're guilty. So that's kind of the process that they go through to try to get their suspect to admit that they're guilty of the crime. It has been shown that this technique is very good for eliciting confessions, but a lot of those may be false confessions. This idea of false confessions, I feel like people have kind of a hard time wrapping their head around, right? Like, why would you, if you're completely innocent, you didn't commit a crime, but a cop suspects that you did for whatever reason, they bring you in and you ask your questions, why would you ever admit to doing something that you didn't do? It seems completely irrational and illogical, right? And yet, the way that this technique is designed is to try to pressure people to admit to doing something, whether they did it or not. And often that idea of a plea bargain is, you know, very early on the table. So the idea is if you admit that you're guilty, then we're going to give you less years or, you know, reduce the fee that you have to pay or whatever. So if you're in a situation where you feel like, okay, I didn't commit this crime, but this cop seems to have evidence that I did for some reason, they're pressuring me to say that I'm guilty, and if I do say I'm guilty, then at least I'm going to get this reduced sentence, right? It's not going to be that bad. So that's what can often lead to these false confessions. I think I mentioned before the Innocence Project. Whenever we talked about something, I'll write that down too because it's something interesting you can look into. So Innocence Project is basically this project to try to exonerate people who have been put in prison incorrectly, who have been accused of crimes they didn't commit. Often these are people who were put in prison like, you know, 20 plus years ago before we had good like DNA sampling and things like that. We didn't have the same forensic techniques that we have now that can be really hard evidence if someone committed a crime or not. So a lot of these people have been in prison for like 20 years, and then we get some DNA evidence that basically proves that they are innocent. I can't remember, I was just reading this statistic and I forgot it. I want to say something like 25% of the people that have been exonerated made a false confession. So it's a pretty common thing, you know, for people to do, even though it seems completely irrational and illogical, people do it all the time. not all the time, but often. And this Reid technique has been shown, like I said, to lead to false confessions. Yes?
Well, and I feel like in that same kind of a category, they kind of pressure you to admit your guilt and not have anybody there to help you. Like they tell you if
Yes.
you get a lawyer, then that means that you're guilty.
Yes.
So if you ask for a lawyer, you're saying you're guilty. So it's just another thing that they're trying to pressure you to say that you did something
Yeah.
that you probably didn't do.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, Alex.
So one thing I observed in working in a manufacturing environment is that when you get stressed, you make dumb decisions. You
Yes.
just become stupid.
Yeah.
And it's like, I can see, they put all this stress on you, and then you're just gonna do things you wouldn't ever do in your right mind.
Yeah.
And, same way in a factory environment, you have, buckets coming down the line, and, people, your bosses don't want you to shut anything off, and so you start doing unsafe stuff when stuff starts getting jammed up.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, totally. I completely agree with you. Yeah, putting people in these conditions definitely puts them in a situation where like it becomes in their best interest in that moment in their own minds to just like say whatever they can say to get out of the interrogation, because it is a very stressful. Yes.
Do what you need to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, okay. There is a different approach that is used for sure in England and a few other places abroad. And there are some social psychologists who are advocating that we make this like policy that in the US all interrogations are, follow this same procedure. It's called the PEACE approach, and the PEACE is like an acronym that stands for different basically phases. I wrote them down because I would not have been able to memorize it in the time I took to prep this. But the first stage, pretty straightforward, is just preparation and planning. That's basically where they're doing like the investigation stage, pretty similar to how we would do it here. But then the next stage is to engage and explain. So this is a portion of the interview where basically first of all, they typically call it an interview instead of an interrogation, which already is a completely different like shift in tone. But during the interview, the first thing they do is they sit the suspect down and they let them know all their rights. They let them know that, like if you want counsel, it's available to you. They basically focus on kind of making the suspect feel comfortable. So they'll go out of their way to ask, like, how do you want us to address you? Basically just kind of preparing the suspect themselves, setting expectations for what the interview is going to be like, essentially. Then they get to the actual account. So during the account stage, essentially all they do is they just ask the suspect, okay, I want you to tell me your version of the story. And then the interviewer shuts up and lets the suspect talk and tell their side. And they ask very like open-ended questions where they essentially just try to get them to tell their story. And they then they will ask sort of pointed specific questions that basically enhance their memory recall. Okay, so the suspect will tell their whole story in as much detail as they can. Then the interviewer will say, okay, I want to go back to the beginning and I want to focus on this particular moment. Can you tell me if you remember, like what were you thinking during this time? Or what was the person you were talking to wearing? Or, do you remember smelling anything in the room? Do you remember seeing anything unusual? So they're asking them questions that prompt kind of like sensory memories. Because research shows that actually the best way to tell if someone is lying is how much detail they can give in their story. Lying is a very like intensive cognitive process. You have to basically make up something, right? You have to make up a story. If you've ever tried to write down or sit down and like write fiction, it's hard, right? It takes effort and work. So if someone is telling the truth, it's usually very easy for them to think of details of the thing that actually happened. If they're lying, they're going to have less detail. So essentially what they're focusing on in this technique is let the person tell their story, go back to specific points in that story, and ask for as much detail as you can possibly get. All right? So that detail, it serves two purposes. One, it's showing if they're lying or not to some extent. It's still not like a perfect measure of lying, right? Like that's not going to tell you for sure if they're lying or not. But also giving those details, obviously, is going to be very pertinent to the investigation, right? Like you want those details in order to figure out who committed the crime, what happened, etc. So really, it's just a very different focus. The Reed technique is focused on, okay, this person is guilty. I'm going to stress them out until they admit it. The Peace approach is, this person might have committed the crime. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. We have reason to think they did, but let's hear them out. Let's hear their side of the story, hear what they have to say, and try to get as much details from them as we possibly can. So it's just a very different, like, philosophical approach to the entire endeavor, basically. Again, so back to research. There's actually a researcher at Iowa State University where I got my degree. So another researcher you can look up. I can never remember how to spell his last name. It's Chris Meisner, but I can't remember if there's one S or two. And he did these really interesting studies where he would have students come into his lab as the participants, and he would have them do like some sort of test, basically, like some sort of like intellectual test that has correct answers and wrong answers or whatever. And it was all sort of designed to make the participant think that that test was the point of the experiment. Kind of like when I gave you guys the math test when we were doing the memory thing. And there would be a Confederate who's also doing the same test, and half of the time that Confederate would try to get the participant to cheat. So he'd try to get them to give them answers, or they would give them answers. The other half the time they wouldn't. Then basically the researcher, Chris Meisner, or one of his graduate students would come out and say, hey, we know you just cheated on this test, and it's really important that we have accurate results. You're going to mess up our research. This is like a major academic integrity violation, right? They would basically accuse them of cheating, and then they would do one of these two techniques. They would either do the Reed technique to get them to confess, or they would do the Peace approach to try to get more information from them. And then they would track how many people gave false confessions. And it turned out, the research basically supports this idea that the Reed technique led to way more false confessions. I don't think they got a single false confession from using the Peace approach, but they get quite a few false confessions from using the Reed technique. So again, there's lots of correlational, like field study research, but then there are also some laboratory experiments that support what I'm saying here. All right, any questions about interrogations?
Did the C stand for the Peace?
Oh yeah, I don't think I went through all the stages. I have it written down, so I don't remember. Okay, so we've got P is plan, prepare and plan. E is engage and explain. A is the account where they actually tell their story. C is closure. Oh, that's another important point. So during closure, the interviewer repeats back the whole story as they understand it. So you have the interviewee, the suspect, tells their whole story. Then the interviewer says, okay, I think I'm understanding you. Here's what I hear you saying. They repeat back the whole story. So then the suspect has an opportunity to clear up any misunderstandings, right? Because the interviewer might have heard something wrong based on biases, just based on, lack of attention or whatever. So the suspect has an opportunity to basically clarify any of those misunderstandings. So that's called closure. And then the last E is evaluate. So that happens after the interview is done, where they're basically just figuring out, okay, how does this information fit with the interrogation thus far, basically. All right. Any other questions about interrogations? Okay. I think we've only got about 2 more slides. We're getting to the point where I would normally give you a break. Do you guys want a break, or do you want to just keep going? How many of you want a break? Okay, we'll keep going. Okay, the next area within the justice system that social psychology is focused on quite a bit is in eyewitness testimony. Again, it's something we've kind of talked about a little bit, although I don't think it was ever a planned lecture topic. It was more just kind of stuff I went on a tangent about, so we'll talk about it in a little more detail now. But some of this might be familiar, which is fine. Okay, so again, think back to the whole, setup that I told you of how the crime typically unfolds and the investigation and all of that. So one thing we always need to consider whenever we're listening to eyewitness testimony is, first of all, the conditions at the time of the crime. And this is something that is, kind of shockingly often ignored in a way that it maybe shouldn't be. So, crimes often take place in conditions where viewing and witnessing is not going to be ideal, right? Because that's kind of the whole point. If you're committing a crime, you're going to commit a crime especially, you're going to do it in a place where you're less likely to have witnesses, right? So it might be done at night when it's dark. It might be done in, some alleyway or somewhere hidden away where view is going to be obstructed. So oftentimes, even if someone witnesses a crime, they're not going to have a very clear view of that. So more than anything, those conditions need to be taken into account first and foremost. So, we need to ask questions about what was the lighting conditions. Another thing to take into account also is was there a weapon present? Were there things that would trigger very stressful emotions? Typically, if an event is unfolding and it stresses us out or makes us emotional, our brains tend to remember the emotional parts of that event at the expense of all of the details that are really important to a crime. And that's particularly true if there's a weapon or if a person feels like their life is in danger. So there's studies that show that if there was a weapon present at the time of the crime, then people have a less detailed memory of the perpetrator's face, or even what the weapon was or what it looked like, or what was the setting. So they lose kind of all those details at the expense of just remembering the fear of a gun being present. So step number 1 is taking all those conditions into account. Okay. Then typically when you have a person who has witnessed a crime, they are going to do a lineup procedure of some kind where they are asked to identify the suspect, and the suspect will be mixed in with some distractors. This can be done as a photo lineup or it can be done as an in-person lineup. So photo lineup, you have a picture of the suspect and then you might have 6 other pictures of other people. And the witness is supposed to just look at those pictures and say, that's the person that I saw commit the crime. Or they also have the option of saying, none of these people committed the crime. In person is the same. You just have people, in a line in real life instead of in photos. Let's see. A couple of things that, again, have sort of come out of the research that are really important. Some of these you might think, well, yeah, that's obvious that we should do that. But the reason that there's research about it, the reason I'm telling you we should do it is because there's a lot of people who do not follow these procedures. So one of the really important things is that the distractors in the lineup should be equivalent to the suspect in as many ways as possible. So some of the worst lineup practices, just as an example, there's one example from the Innocence Project. I can't remember the name of the guy that ended up in prison. But during the lineup where the witness identified him, his picture was the only picture that was in color, and all of the distractors were black and white. There's cases where the suspect is the only one who matches the description. So maybe the description is okay, the person who committed this crime was a white female, 5'3", brown hair, or whatever, and the suspect will match that description. But all the distractors are some of them have blonde hair, some of them aren't white women, some of them are, completely different. So it's really important that whatever distractors you're using in the lineup be equivalent to the suspect as much as possible. Yeah.
Can that fit with clothing as well?
Yes. Yeah. So
In-person lineup?
yeah, so that's why you'll see, if you watch in movies or whatever, often when they do the lineups, they'll have the people in the orange jumpsuit or whatever. The best practice is to have the suspect and the distractors wear something that's as close as possible to the witness's description. So if the witness says, okay, the suspect was wearing a beanie and a hoodie and black sneakers or whatever, then that's what your suspect and your distractors should be wearing in the photo or in the in-person lineup. But again, that's typically not done or often not done. Okay, another really interesting line of research tries to look at kind of the logistical setup of how the lineup is done. So typically the lineup is done in what's called the simultaneous setup. So in a simultaneous setup, you have the suspect and you have the 6 photos or whatever, all just laid on the table at the same time. And the witness is supposed to look at all those pictures and pick one. Or again, you have the person line up where all the 6 distractors and the suspect are standing right there at the same time. The witness is supposed to pick them. there's research that shows that what that does, whenever you put people in that condition where they have all these pictures they're looking at simultaneously, their brain isn't trying to remember the suspect and think like, do any of these look like the suspect? Instead, they're thinking, which one of these looks the most like the suspect? Do you see the difference in that? And so if you're just trying to figure out which one looks the most like the suspect, one of those just statistically is going to look more like the suspect than the others. And so even if that person isn't the perpetrator, right? The cops got the wrong guy. The suspect they put in the lineup isn't the person who committed the crime. If they look more like the perpetrator than the rest of them, then, you know, the witness is going to pick them, right? So a better way to do it is what's called a sequential lineup. So in a sequential lineup, you have the suspect and the distractors in a random order, and the participant or the witness sees them one at a time, and they either say yes or no. Yes, this was the person. No, it was not the person. As soon as they say yes, it stops. They don't see any more pictures. Okay? So that more activates that part of the brain that's trying to remember. Now you're trying to remember back, okay, what did the suspect look like? I'm going to compare this picture to that memory instead of comparing it to all these other pictures in front of my face. Does that make sense? So that's a pretty simple change, right? It doesn't take really any like major resources or anything. Maybe you have to have a computer that can do things in random order instead of just having pictures printed out on a table. But otherwise, it's pretty simple. So there's a lot of researchers, again, who try to advocate, like, these are policies that our justice system should follow. Right now, it's not that case. A lot of lineups are still done with a simultaneous procedure. But yeah. And then in addition, I think this is one of the things we talked about. The witness should not be given feedback of any kind. So often what will happen, again, let's say the cop brings in a suspect and the cop is fully convinced this is the person who did it because of their investigation. And then they show the lineup to the witness and the witness picks the suspect. Then the cop might say like, oh, great job. That's our guy. That's the guy that we thought, right? They might give them some kind of feedback that basically makes them think you picked the right person. And what we talked about before is that what that can do is then increase that person's confidence. So now the witness feels like, you know, maybe they weren't really sure when they picked out the suspect, but now that the cop is saying, oh, you picked our guy, their confidence goes through the roof. They think, oh my gosh, I picked the right person. So then when they go to testify at trial, that confidence is going to show through. And people will mistakenly think that confidence is an indicator of the accuracy of their memory, when, as we've talked about, confidence has nothing to do with the accuracy of memory. So no feedback is also very important. And then regardless of whether they got feedback or not, that confidence should be ignored at the time of the trial. That one's very difficult. You basically have to have like an expert witness come up on trial and explain everything I just explained to your jury so that the jury doesn't take that confidence into account. But even if you're told don't take confidence into account, it's very hard for our brains to like ignore that. So I don't know, maybe there's creative ways that we could get around that. There's been some talk of doing more like trials like virtually and maybe even having people be avatars instead of showing their actual face. Because another topic I could talk about forever is like the biases that come from just, you know, seeing a suspect or a witness on the stand based on their race, their gender, their, you know, cleanliness. All those factors can bias people to think certain things. So, you know, if we did things virtually, there might also be a way to like alter people's voices to where that confidence doesn't come through. Yeah, Margaret.
I feel like that goes back to the no feedback, where your like body language gives them feedback, basically. Like,
Yes, yeah.
The investigator can be disappointed or...
Yeah, even if they don't say anything, it might show on their face.
Yeah, it still shows.
Yep.
It can still give that false confidence.
Yeah. So another thing that's been advocated for is that also during the lineup, that the lineup is not administered by the prosecutor or the cops, but instead is administered by someone who's like blind. It's called double blind, right? Like the participant obviously doesn't know who the suspect is, but also the person administering the lineup, the person who comes in and sets the photos down or whatever, that they would not know who the suspect is.
Like a third party.
Yes. Yeah. So that would be the ideal way to do the lineup. Okay. Any other questions or comments about eyewitness testimony? or any other justice system stuff. Those are the two topics I chose. Again, there's obviously justice system, massive and complex, and all kinds of steps and procedures that we could talk about. Lots of research in other areas, but those were the two that I kind of knew the most about.